Dear Uz Report World viewers, welcome to our Zoom studio today, and we have an exclusive guest in our studio, IMF Director for Middle East, Caucasus, and Central Asia, Mr. Jihad AZOUR, with his economic outlook. Mr. Jihad, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're glad to see you today. Mr. Jihad, I have several questions to you as usual, if you don't mind. And I'll start with the first one. So, Mr. Jihad, what is the impact of the pandemic's second wave for the region?
Well, thank you very much again for having me. Indeed, we are in a very important moment because after a year like no other, 2020 was a shock that affected the global economy, including countries in Caucasus and Central Asia. The beginning of this year is a year where we have a race between the virus and the vaccine. More than two-thirds of the countries of the region are currently facing a second wave. And this second wave is, in fact, unfortunately, becoming more, I would say, deeper than the previous one. The prospect of having a vaccine is light at the end of the tunnel. Today, what is important is accelerate the vaccination. And here there is a diversity in the region between countries who have already been advanced in that and the others who are lagging. It's important to maintain and to focus some of the policies to protect lives and to maintain the livelihood of people afloat. And three is to see how now countries need to deepen their reform to accelerate the recovery. It's a moment where we have high level of uncertainties, and we are seeing a recovery that is uneven between countries. And this is what it makes it very important today for policymakers to be focused and also to be very proactive.
Well, thank you so much. My another question is, how would you assess Uzbekistan's monetary policy? And do you think the country could at any way stay away from all those debts?
Well, as you know, Uzbekistan last year was among the countries who were able to manage the crisis with a limited impact. Among the very few in the region who was able to have a tiny but a positive growth. And the recovery this year is expected to reach, in terms of recovery, a level of growth of 5%, which is, in comparison to other parts of the world and including in the region, is a positive step. Last year, too, government took certain number of measures in order to protect lives by dedicating certain number of fiscal as well as also financial instruments to provide support to lives of people and to livelihoods. And the central bank introduced certain number of also measures to preserve the liquidity in the system and also to absorb part of the shock. And those were steps that helped Uzbekistan recover and recover fast. Of course, the level of debt is still relatively under control, although we witnessed an increase in debt like in other parts of the world. Priority is to maintain inflation under control, deepen the reforms that were initiated back in 2017, and allow the private sector to grow its role by maintaining the reform path that Uzbekistan has introduced, and also attract additional investment, which was one of the priorities that Uzbekistan has put over the last few years.
Well, Mr. Jihad, you mentioned about 5% inflation. I'd like to go a little bit deeper. Uzbekistan hasn't changed its plans to reduce its inflation to 5% by 2023. Do you consider this target approachable, especially when the real inflation, in my opinion, is far higher than the official figures?
Well, of course, we have to accept that we are in uncertain moments these days. The volatility we saw last year, for example, on the oil price and price of commodities, some of the disruptions in the value chains need to be, I would say, watched. global conditions, international conditions in terms of inflation are still favorable, as well as also the conditions on the financial markets. And therefore, this is a target that is achievable, and the policies that are currently being contemplated would put this objective within reach in the next few years.
Mm-hmm. You know that the vaccination is going on all around the world now. And what do you think, how the vaccine plans affected the states, which are largely reliant on COVAX?
Well, the two elements to mention here. One is getting access to a diversity of sources is always better than relying on one or two sources. This is one. Second, it's very important for countries to accelerate the procurement and the distribution of vaccine. Of course, COVAX is an internationally developed initiative, but it's, I think, important to make sure that resources are available to get as soon as possible the vaccines available, and to work on diversifying the sources of the vaccination. Logistics is going to be important because the nature of the vaccine would require a different level of logistics. But I think among all is to highlight the importance of acceleration of the vaccination, because this will not only save lives, but also will help accelerate the recovery. And recently, in our analysis for the region, we're showing that if you accelerate the vaccine, you could have an additional bonus in terms of growth by 0.3 or 0.5% of growth for this year, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Mr. Jihad, what can you tell us about CCA and MENA growth for 2020?
Well, the situation here also needs to be differentiated between countries. 2020 was a big shock that affected oil exporting countries more than oil importing countries in MENA, which was the opposite in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Countries who are oil exporting or commodity exporting, who were able to provide fiscal and monetary stimulus, were able to cushion the economy and reduce the negative impact of the shock. Of course, those who had less capacity to deploy measures did not have the same capacity to reduce the impact of the shock. 2021, we expect economies to recover. Certain countries, particularly in Central Asia and Caucasus, could from 2021 regain the lost ground of 2020 and reach levels of 2019. This is going to be the case, for example, for Uzbekistan and a few other countries. Of course, in the CCA2, some of the oil importing countries were faced with severe impact of the crisis on some key sectors like tourism, like export or remittances. And this is the recovery of those will depend on the global recovery and will depend on their capacity to rein in the second wave of the COVID-19. I think last but not the least, 2020 was a year of crisis like no other. 2021 is the year of a reset. And I hope 2022 will be the year of accelerated recovery. For that to happen, it's very important for countries to invest on where the recovery could fast track. Technology is very important. Improving the level of productivity by investing in infrastructure that is forward-looking in terms of communication, in terms of logistics. Investing in environment and all what would green the recovery. All these priorities will help countries fast-track their recovery.
Well, Mr. Jihad, coming back to the vaccines, regarding the Central Asian countries, which one has limited access to vaccines and will be hit harder in 2021? What do you think?
Well, the good news here is most of the Caucasus and Central Asian countries will have access to vaccine. The last positive news is they have still access to a limited number of sources. And one of the lessons of the vaccine management is broader you can rely on diversity of sources, better it is. And therefore, we expect that the vaccination will take place in a fairly good way. We encourage countries to diversify their source of vaccination in order for them to make sure that they will not face some of the risks of disruptions that some of, for example, European countries are facing currently. Of course, it's a race. And in this race, it's very important not only to accelerate the vaccination, but also to contain and rein in the spreading of the virus. This is also the second priority. Third priority is this crisis has revealed some weaknesses, especially in terms of inclusion at the youth, at the women level, at some of the informal sectors. It's very important to make sure that the policies that were designed last year to protect economies are now more and more well targeted to address where the most challenging groups of the societies are.
Thank you so much. According to your opinion, what would be the most appropriate priority to decline the economic impact for Central Asian states, especially Uzbekistan, for 2021? And whether vaccination is the light of hope at the end of the tunnel, which you mentioned in the beginning of your speech?
Well, again, it's an exceptional year. It's a year that requires strong institutions, and the institutions will play an important role in addressing those challenges and providing the right framework, procuring the vaccines, providing the right measures, fiscal, monetary, as well as also regulatory measures for that, healthcare measures. It's important to not lose sight on some of the important reforms that were planned. And in the case of Uzbekistan, the reforms of modernizing the state-owned entities, modernizing the market organization, providing greater access to finance, especially for small, medium-sized enterprises, increase the level of economic exchange with countries of the region, reposition the economy to gain from where the global economy will be. Those are the priorities that countries of the region have for 2021, and Uzbekistan among them. I think the last point is this is a year of also of an uncertainty, and it's very important to keep very agile, to remain very agile in order to be able to adjust to the needs or to the emerging challenges.
Mr. Jihad, thank you so much for your informative speech today and for your time. It is definitely our pleasure, and hope to see you soon here in Tashkent in our studio.
Thank you for having me.
Dear UZ Report World viewers, we had an exclusive guest today, IMF Director for Middle East, Caucasus and Central Asia, Mr. Jihad AZOUR. Thank you so much.